Hey guys, this is Air and welcome to the 30th episode of Death Row Executions. Today's story is on Velma Barfield, born Margie Velma Bullard, who was executed on November 2nd, 1984 in North Carolina. She was a serial killer who confessed to murdering 5 people and was the first female to be executed by lethal injection. Thank you to everyone who participated and voted for today's feature, and thank you to the ones who went on my suggestions video and suggested Velma. Velma was born on October 29, 1932 in South Carolina. Her family later moved to Fayetteville, North Carolina, where she grew up and spent the rest of her life. She was the second born of 9 children, and the family was very poor. Before leaving for North Carolina, the family lived in a rural area in an unpaid house that had no electricity, running water, or bathrooms. The Great Depression was affecting the family, so Velma's grandparents and aunt also lived in the house. Her Aunt Susan was disabled, and polio had caused her arm and leg to shrivel. Velma's father Murphy was in the cotton and tobacco sales industry, but he was not able to make a living and changed professions, working as a logger in a sawmill. This new job allowed him to move his family into a better house. Murphy eventually got a job in North Carolina, and that same year, both of his parents passed away. Velma's father Murphy was hardworking, but was easily angered and drank a lot. Her mother Lily was submissive and listened to everything that was demanded of her. Velma was abused by her father, and she resented her mother because her mother witnessed the abuse but did nothing about it. The reason Lily never stepped in because she too was abused and was afraid of getting hurt herself. Velma and her older brother Olive were always at odds as well and resented each other because he believed he got beat more than Velma and their dad favored her. Velma believed that their mother favored Olive, and within the family there were many broken relationships and ill feelings towards each other. In 1939, at the age of 7, Velma started school for the first time and enjoyed the fact that school was an escape from her unstable home. The happiness soon turned into sadness and fear because she started getting bullied about her used and damaged clothing, as well as the small bland lunch meals she would bring from home. She began to eat alone and eventually started stealing so she could buy things that other kids had. She started by stealing coins out of her dad's pants pockets and gradually turned into stealing from others. Her last time stealing as a child was when she was busted for taking $80 from a neighbor, and her dad beat her so bad she said that she never thought about stealing again. Things started to get progressively worse for Velma, and she was designated to do most of the work on her family's farm, as well as having the responsibility of caring for her younger siblings. She felt as if she was the black sheep in the family and was quoted saying that she felt like she was a slave. She cooked every meal for the family and was often dismissed from school early so she could complete her chores. Velma was the only girl amongst her siblings for a while, and during times her dad was not physically abusing her, he would spoil her on occasions but sexually abuse her. She was sleeping in her parents' bed up until high school, and she said that at times she did not know if her father's touches were sexual or not. Velma, now 13 and attending high school, joined the basketball team and enjoyed herself, but had to quit because her mother had twins and needed Velma to stay at home to help her with the newborns. It was during this time, staying at home more often, that things progressed with her father from touching to rape. School was still her escape, and she began taking a liking to a boy by the name of Thomas Burke. Thomas liked Velma as well, and she asked her father if she could date him, but her father said not until she turned 16. When her 16th birthday rolled around, Murphy initially had second thoughts, but ultimately relented and gave Velma restrictions. She was only allowed to go on double dates and had to be home by 10 o'clock at night. In order to avoid any type of punishment or abuse, Velma made sure to follow the rules. By age 17 and a junior in high school, Velma accepted a marriage proposal from Thomas. Her father was not happy, but the two of them married, quit school, and ran off together. Thomas did not like the idea of Velma working, so she was able to quit her job and stay at home while Thomas worked his various odd jobs. They moved a couple of times before settling in Parkton, North Carolina, near Velma's parents. Although the two ran off together, they still frequently saw Velma's family because they attended the same Baptist church. On December 15, 1951, at the age of 19, Velma gave birth to her first son, Ronald Thomas, and a couple of years later, on September 3, 1953, she gave birth to her daughter, Kim. Velma reportedly was a great mother and was always involved in her children's lives. She wanted them to grow up religious and regularly took them to church, where she eventually began teaching her Sunday school class. For a while, Velma was able to continue being a stay-at-home mom, but once her children started school, she was always involved. She frequently volunteered to go on field trips or help any teachers who needed assistance. She also gave kids rides home after school because they thought that she was a cool mom. Thomas was struggling, so Velma ended up getting a job at a textile plant, working from midnight to 8 o'clock in the morning to help out. Thomas started working as a delivery driver for Pepsi Cola, and the two were able to eventually save enough money and move into a nicer home. In her early 30s, Velma experienced health issues and underwent a hysterectomy and also experienced severe back pain. This is when she believed her personality switched and she became very depressed and angry. She felt as if she was not an adequate woman, and during this time, her husband Thomas began to heavily drink, and the two frequently got into arguments. Thomas began to stay out late with his friends, and Velma began to resent him for his absence and his drinking. In 1965, Thomas got into a car accident, and 2 years later, in 1967, he got into another car accident while driving drunk and was arrested. Subsequently, he lost his driver's license and his job and fell into a depression himself. Thomas began to get abusive with his son as well, and on one occasion threatened to kill him with a knife. Velma was overwhelmed and passed out on the floor due to the stress. Her son was the one who found her, and she was sent to the hospital and had to be hospitalized for a week and was prescribed sedatives and other medication. One of the drugs she was prescribed was Librium. She became addicted and would go to different doctors without them knowing she was being prescribed the same medication from other doctors. Her choice of pills were Librium and Valium. On April 21, 1969, while Ronald and Kim were at school and Velma was supposedly at the local laundromat, their house caught on fire. It was reported that Thomas was drunk and fell asleep with a lit cigarette, and it fell, causing the house to catch fire, leaving Thomas to die of smoke inhalation. The family was torn, but spirits were lifted when Velma's son Ronald graduated high school as salutatorian and made a speech in front of his whole class that was dedicated to his mother Velma. The joy did not last long, and the new house that the family had just moved into burned to the ground, and they were forced to live with Velma's parents while she waited for the insurance payout. The same year Thomas died, Velma was introduced to the brother of her co-worker by the name of Jennings Barfield, who was also a recent widower. The two of them lost their spouses at around the same time, and less than a year after meeting, the two married on August 23, 1970. Velma became his primary caretaker as well because Jennings suffered from diabetes and emphysema. Velma moved to Fayetteville to live with Jennings and his daughter Nancy. Velma was still a drug addict, and 2 months after they married, Velma overdosed for the first time and again was hospitalized for a whole week. Jennings was the one who found her barely conscious and took her to the hospital. Witnessing this for the first time, he expressed his doubts in marrying Velma to his family. The two separated for a while, but Velma swore she would quit and the two got back together. Not too long after reconciling their relationship, Velma broke her word again and overdosed a second time 3 months after her first overdose. Jennings was not happy with the way his relationship was going, and Velma did not like the fact that he no longer wanted to be with her. A month after her second overdose, on March 22, 1971, she poisoned Jennings with arsenic. He already had trouble breathing, and his breathing became worse. He had symptoms of vomiting and diarrhea as well. He eventually died on March 21, 1971, but the death, however, was ruled as heart failure. Towards the end of 1971, Velma had a near-death experience overdosing again and spent 3 weeks in intensive care. She lost her job and also lost her home. She was no longer able to pay the mortgage, but her house surprisingly caught on fire and burned to the ground, so her and her daughter Kim moved in with her parents. The following year, in 1972, Velma's father Murphy passed away, and she slipped into a deeper depression and had at least 3 doctors prescribing her the same medication to feed her habit. In March 1972, Velma forging prescriptions caught up with her, and she was arrested. She pled guilty, but received a suspended sentence and a fine. The suspended sentence is usually handed out to first-time offenders or criminals who commit less serious crimes, and they are put on probation instead of spending time in jail in order to prevent overcrowding. Velma began stealing from her mother, and in 1974 she took out a $1,000 loan by forging her mother's name and used her mother's house as collateral. The following month, she took out another loan for $1,000 in her mother's name and also wrote 5 bad checks that were attached to a closed bank account of her ex-husband, Jennings Barfield. The loan company soon sent an overdue notice to Velma's mother's house, and instead of communicating her issues with her mother, she decided to buy poison in St. Paul, North Carolina in order to kill her. Summer 1974, Velma gave her mother a dose of the poison and drove her to the hospital because she fell ill. Her mother recovered and was eventually sent home. The same summer, Velma was dating a man who was killed in a car accident. It has not been reported how long the two were dating, but he made Velma the beneficiary of his life insurance policy, and she received $5,000 after his death. Later that year, when the family came together for Christmas, Lily brought up the notice she received from the loan company to one of her sons, and a couple of days later she fell ill again because Velma had given her another dose of the poison. She soon began vomiting and having uncontrollable diarrhea. Her complications were similar to Jennings, and Lily was not able to walk or bear the pain. Velma called the doctor, and her brother called for medical help, and when the ambulance arrived, Velma rode in the back with her mother to the hospital, but her mother Lily was soon pronounced dead on December 30th, 1974. Velma agreed to an autopsy, and they concluded that there was no sign of poisoning, but the autopsy was conducted a few months after her death. The following month and year, Velma moved in with her daughter and son-in-law, and a month after her move, police arrived at the house confronting her about the bounced checks she had written on Jennings' closed account. She was not able to repay the debt, and she attempted to commit suicide. She overdosed on prescription pills and fell, causing her to break her collarbone, and spent 3 weeks in the hospital. As soon as she was released, she was arrested and sent to the Correctional Center for Women in Raleigh, North Carolina, but only served 4 months and was released early for good behavior. Midsummer 1975, Kim called Velma's doctors and asked them to stop prescribing Velma pain medication because she was caught forging checks from her son-in-law Dennis in order to purchase the medication. Towards the end of the year, Velma moved and got free room and board along with $75 a week because she was hired as a live-in caretaker for a 93-year-old man by the name of Montgomery Edwards. His wife Dolly also lived in the house but was unable to look after him because her health was also not in the best condition. Montgomery was blind and also had both of his legs amputated. Dolly was unhappy with Velma, believing that she was slacking on her job, and the two argued frequently. On January 29, 1977, Montgomery died, and on February 28th, Velma purchased more poison so that she could kill Dolly. Dolly experienced the same symptoms as Velma's previous victims, and Velma was the one who called emergency and drove Dolly to the hospital. She was released after spending 3 nights there, but fell ill again and died the next day. Velma finished what she started, and Dolly succumbed to the poison and passed away on March 1, 1977. Not too soon after the death of her previous employers, Velma began working for a new elderly couple by the names of John and Record Henry. Shortly after she started working, she began forging checks again, and Record found a check she knew she did not sign and had her husband call the cops. The case went nowhere because they were unable to discover who forged her name. Once that investigation was over, Velma forged another check, but this time she forged John's name. In order to prevent him from finding out, she poisoned him, and John soon became very ill and experienced vomiting, diarrhea, and was unable to get about. After spending a few days in the hospital, he was released, and the doctors assumed he had a virus. John's children were happy and thankful that Velma was kind to their father and doing her best to take care of him. He eventually died, and the cause of his death was ruled a heart attack. Instead of staying with Record Henry, Velma decided to move in with a man by the name of Stuart Taylor, who was actually the nephew of Montgomery and Dolly. Stuart was an alcoholic, but the two got along great. Stuart was happy because he felt that Velma was an honest and religious Christian woman. The relationship took a turn for the worse on Velma's end when he found out that she had previously spent time in prison. Velma began her cycle of forging checks and stole multiple checks from Stuart. In order to prevent him from finding out, she bought another bottle of poison in an attempt to kill him. In December 1977, Stuart was given a dose of the poison, and that same day he had surprised Velma to a trip to see the famous Rex Humbert at the Cumberland County Civic Center in Fayetteville, North Carolina. As soon as they sat in their chairs, Stuart started to feel sick and told Velma he thought it was from something he ate. He could no longer handle the pain and left Velma alone while he went back to the car to lay down. Velma stayed for the duration of the event, and when it was over, she met Stuart in the car and drove them home. The next morning, Velma spoke with Stuart's daughter Alice and informed her of her father's condition, and before getting off the phone, Velma agreed with Alice that it was most likely the flu. Hours later, Velma contacted Stuart's best friend Sonny and informed him of Stuart's condition as well. That next day, she decided to take Stuart to the hospital. The doctors said Stuart had gastritis and gave him medication and discharged him. The following day, Sonny stopped by to check on Stuart and noticed his condition improved. The day after that, his health began to decline again, and instead of calling the cops, Velma phoned a neighbor by the name of John and told him to call the paramedics. John called for Velma, and when paramedics arrived, they recounted later that the room had a horrible odor because there was vomit in the room and diarrhea in the bed. They put Stuart in the ambulance, but after an hour after being attended to in the hospital, he passed away on February 3, 1978. The doctors were confused as to the cause of death and suggested an autopsy be done. Stuart's daughter asked Velma what they should do, and she replied by saying if they did not do it, they will always wonder. Soon after Stuart's death, Velma attended his funeral, and along with her came her son Ronald. They sat next to Alice, and after the service was over, Ronald said to Alice, "You know, it's the saddest thing, but it seems like everybody my mother ever gets close to dies. How could the good Lord allow this to happen to a faithful Christian like Velma Barfield?" The same day as Stuart's funeral, the local Lumberton police received a phone call of a woman in distress very early in the morning, and the caller hung up the phone, and the officer who answered thought it was a prank call. The call slipped his mind, and later that day, the same woman called, claiming that she knew Velma Barfield killed her husband and others. The officer tried to ask for evidence or proof, but the woman was unable to give any specific details. She cried, and finally, Officer Phillips asked her how she knew all of the information being said, and she replied by saying that she was Velma's sister. Officer Phillips called the Lumberton Hospital and asked if there was anyone who had recently died that weekend, and after confirming Stuart Taylor had died, he was told that they were waiting on the autopsy by examiner Dr. Bob Andrews. In March, the autopsy results came in, but they concluded that Stuart died from gastroenteritis, and Dr. Andrews decided to investigate further by taking a sample of liver tissue and sending it to North Carolina's chief medical examiner because he believed Stuart was a healthy man and that cause of death was not normal. After the chief examiner, Paige Hudson, received the samples, she was on the phone with Dr. Andrews and asked for more details about Stuart's death. He mentioned Velma bringing him in and described the symptoms, and Paige Hudson immediately asked, "Where did she get the arsenic, Bob?" They ran the proper tests, and he was found to have arsenic in his system. On March 10, 1978, police arrived at Velma's house and brought her in for questioning, which lasted for 3 hours. 3 days after questioning, Velma attempted to commit suicide by overdosing, and her son Ronald was there to help her. That same day, she made a detailed confession, was arrested and charged with murder and sent to jail. Her attorney, Bob Jacobson, who represented her in trial, was able to get Velma her prescribed medication while in jail. They tried to plead insanity, and Velma was sent to Dorothea Dix State Hospital for 5 weeks to be evaluated. She was found to be competent to stand trial and was sent back to Lumberton Jail to await her trial. Before trial, Velma became a born-again Christian after watching an evangelist program by J.K. Kinkle. Her trial started toward the end of the year in November 1978 in Elizabethtown, North Carolina, and her charge was first-degree murder for killing Stuart Taylor. In court, she confessed to killing Dolly, Montgomery, and John. She expressed that she only intended to make them feel sick and not to kill them, and was trying to prevent them from finding out she was stealing from them. Exactly 1 week after the trial started, the jury found Velma Barfield guilty of murder, and she was sentenced to death by method of lethal injection. Velma was sent to death row at the Correctional Center for Women in Raleigh, North Carolina, and at the time was the only woman waiting on death row. She was later transferred to Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. Many said that while on trial, Velma sealed her fate because of her angry attitude and demeanor. While on death row, she was finally able to get clean from all drugs and had a come-to moment where she accepted her faith again and had a personal reverend by the name of Hugh Hoyle and had frequent visitors. Popular evangelist Billy Graham, along with his wife Ruth and daughter Anne, were the few on Velma's visitor list who frequently saw her and corresponded with her. She received the nickname Death Row Granny and Mama Margie because of her impact on other prisoners and also being older than them as well. Velma received a few stays of execution, but the North Carolina appeals were denied, and the Supreme Court ultimately refused to hear her case. Some of Velma's supporters spoke to Governor Hunt, but he denied her clemency as well on September 27, 1984. In one of her final conversations with her son Ronald before her execution, he asked her, "Did you kill him?" Velma responded, "I'm sure I probably did." She claimed to not remember fully, but believed that their father was drunk and she put a cigarette or match at the end of the bed and shut the door behind her. This was the first time she admitted to killing her first husband, and Velma also admitted to a minister that she killed Jennings Barfield as well, making the total number of victims 7. Her execution day was set for November 2, 1984, and Billy Graham's daughter told her, "Don't think of it as an execution chamber, think of it as the gateway to heaven." She also was able to get a last-minute phone call with Billy Graham, who told her, "Velma, in a way I envy you because you're going to get to heaven before I do." For Velma's last meal, she had cheese doodles and a Coke, and while in her cell, she took her final communion and then put on an adult diaper underneath the pajamas she was approved to wear for her execution. She also requested to wear a robe that was approved, and after being strapped in, she was asked if she had any last words. "I want to say that I am sorry for all the hurt that I have caused. I know that everybody has gone through a lot of pain, all the families connected, and I am sorry. And I want to thank everybody who has been supporting me all these 6 years. I want to thank my family for standing with me through all of this, and my attorney, and all the support to me. Everybody, the people with the prison department, I appreciate everything, their kindness, and everything that they have shown me during these 6 years. For this specific execution, there were 3 executioners in the room. Each of them pushed something that was connected to a dummy release so that no one would know who actually administered the lethal injection. After this, she was asked to start counting down from 100 and made it to 98 before she became silent and started to snore. Her skin changed colors, and she was pronounced dead at 2:15 in the morning on November 2, 1984, making her the first woman to die by lethal injection. Before her execution, she wrote letters to families of her victims and gave it to Reverend Hugh to distribute. After her death, he went along with Velma's request, but no one accepted a letter. If you made it this far, thank you so much for taking the time to listen and watch this episode. Please give this video a like for me. And now for discussion and question time. You don't have to answer every question, but if you do choose to answer at least one, thank you so much for the interaction. So, question 1. Velma was addicted to prescription pills, but still nagged her husband about his alcohol consumption, saying it was the devil's drink. I think that this was very hypocritical of her. Have any of you ever experienced someone telling you to stop doing something, but they were doing something just as bad, and instead of looking at themselves, they only judged you? Velma's attorneys continued to argue that she was insane while appealing for stays of execution. Does it make sense to you for someone to plead insanity, but also be deemed a mother figure and a born-again Christian in prison? If you are truly insane, how would you be able to make those type of rational decisions? Have any of you experienced knowing someone like Velma, someone who appeared to be so innocent and kind in public, volunteered or was very religious, but behind closed doors they were a completely different person? I personally have had the experience of outside people complimenting someone I knew until these people witnessed their true behavior and realized that they were not who they portrayed to be in the public. This is why I can appreciate a kind person at face value, but I do not put people on pedestals. A Catholic priest can be a molester, and so can someone who does not preach to others. Why should I hold someone to a certain standard when I have no idea what they do behind closed doors? The recent story I did on the decorated Army veteran Lewis Jones Jr., he fought for our country, but still abused and raped multiple women and also killed. If you did not know anything of his horrible behavior, most would put him on a pedestal. For me, I can appreciate the fight, but again, I have no idea what you do behind closed doors, so someone shaking his hands and saluting him would do so not knowing that he was a rapist. Velma stayed at the gospel event while Stuart Taylor was slowly dying from poison in the car. Would any of you stay with your partner if they let you stay in the car for hours while you were sick and they enjoyed a concert? I'm curious because I have heard some say that there is no issue with that. Thank you guys for interacting, and I would like to give a shout out to Pamela. Thank you for becoming a patron on my Patreon. If any of you are interested in joining my Patreon, I will put a link in the description box below.